this is Levridge in Dynamics 365. So this is basically a product that allows for us to do a lot of the commodity processing so that we can actually do basis, cash contracts, and all those types of things from a commodity perspective. But at the same time, then use Dynamics 365 to do all the accounting, all the manufacturing, all the asset management, all the fixed assets. I think you get it. It's just got a lot of great capability basically from a Microsoft platform perspective. Now, there are a couple of different ways to be able to access information inside of Dynamics, and this is all pretty much personalizable. So anything that you see on the screen, you can add and show columns, you can hide them, you can change the layout with it, and you don't have to pay someone to do it. It's called personalization inside of our environment. The reason I bring that up at the beginning of this demonstration is because I'm an administrator and I need to be able to access all these different areas as we navigate through the functionality inside of our system. So just a heads up, I know some people look at it and they're like, the screen is too busy. Well, you know what? You can just right click and hide columns if you want to as part of your process. So coming over here to our far left, I'm going to open up my menu bar. And one of the things I just want to highlight quickly is just all the different types of capabilities that we have inside of Dynamics. So if you've got planning, landed cost management that you need to run, sales orders and management of orders and agreements and contracts, all of those areas are actually modules that are inside of here that we can access and interact with. Now in our environment, we're going to be primarily focusing on this asset management area, and I'm bringing up what's called an area page on purpose intentionally to let you kind of look at this screen and kind of answer maybe some of the other questions that you may have that obviously we can't answer directly here right now, but things like spare parts or asset bill of materials so I can look at what I have inside of there, or understanding, for example, different types of life cycles that are related to assets. These are all base setups and configurations that we can manage then inside of Dynamics 365 to be able to really manage your assets and how you interact with them. So really great expansive capability inside of here that you can use. Now, if you want to, what you can do is you can just set up favorites, and that's what I did inside of this demonstration as well, so that you can just really quickly get to that information so that you don't have to go search for a module access to be able to get that information. Or you could type search up here, for example, to get to it too. I just want to highlight that just because, like I said, different people like different levels of access inside of the system, and we accommodate all the way to those super power users, all the way down to mobile devices, which we're going to demonstrate as we go through this process as well. So first things first, I'm going to take a look at my asset list that I have inside of here, and we're going to pick on a couple of different assets that we have. Now, when I clicked on that area, what you probably saw is that the screen went through and changed more to the common Excel type look that you're kind of expecting within a business system. Number one, we've got, for example, all of our different actions up top here that we can interact with from an asset perspective on our screen so that we can very quickly, for example, see a bill of materials related to an asset, or even see, for example, the maintenance schedule that's been set up for this particular asset. I can take this information and I can collapse it, for example, so that way I've got more screen real estate if I want to interact with it. I can take this information and I can actually send it to Excel if I wanted to. So if I actually want to take this information, click on it, and then export that to Excel, as you can see here when it opens, I can then have Excel open up, and then it can access this information directly as well so that I can interact with it. And the cool thing about the Excel-based capabilities within Dynamics is the fact that it allows you actually to make it editable as well. So you can also, what we call, export it to Excel, but if you want to be able to actually take it and then make changes inside of Excel to be able to update any of these lists or areas that we're interacting with, I'm going to go ahead and enable this. This is a quick template that I created for this example, but you can see here on the far right, we've got a connector basically with Dynamics, and what it's going to do is it's going to grab all of those assets and allow me then potentially to make changes or updates to it and then republish them back into the environment using all that business logic that we've come to know and love inside of Dynamics. So a really powerful integration capability as part of that really allows for you to kind of then do some of those other scenarios where people ask me, I want to do some mass updates to my assets. I want to assign a bunch of manufacturing manufacturer and model information, for example, to it. Well, you can do that inside of Excel very easily and quickly. One of the other areas I just want to highlight too, attachments. You want to do an attachment for pictures, images, Word documents, whatever it is that you want to have on an asset. You can click on your attachments icon here. That's always on every single screen, as you're going to see as we go through this. And then I can, for example, create different types of files or images or notes or URLs or even SharePoint sites that I can link then to these assets to actually have additional information about them. Now, as we drill down a little bit, I want to pick on a forklift. I think a forklift almost every commodity processor has for some of those ingredients that you're actually going to take and potentially move. Some may have extruders, drives, compressors for the lines that they have to move particular product back and forth. The point here is that we've got some demo data that we have set up inside of here that really shows all these different types of assets that we can maintain inside of here. And when we look at an asset, there's different levels that are related to it. So you can see here that we have the capability to actually have what's called a parent asset set up for it. So in this environment, I've got an extruder line that we have for some of the product that we generate. And we have 5 different child assets that are related then to this main asset that we have inside of the system. So you can imagine we've got DC drives that we have that are running this. We've got a screw, for example. We've got blenders that are involved with it. We have all these different types of pieces of equipment basically that we're maintaining and managing then from an asset perspective inside of here that we can interact with. Now, when we open an asset, what you can see here as I kind of highlight this, one of the things just to note is that any of these fields that have an underline around them is a hyperlink, right? And because we're in a modern web-based browser that can be accessed from any location in the world, you can basically go through and then, for example, highlight and then click on that particular hyperlink to then bring you into additional detail related then to that particular asset. And I want to highlight this because there's a couple of things that are always asked around, especially rolling stock, for example. And you can see here, I've got a manufacturer model number, model year, and serial number that I can actually attach then to my assets to be able to track this. And what I can also do is I can add additional fields if I want to be able to track additional details then about that particular asset. So I've got a type or a category of that asset. I've got a functional location that tells me, for example, that it's in a particular plant, because we can actually set these up, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as a next step. We can basically set up, all these different types of functional locations to really then drive where the asset is located inside of our processing plant. And if it's a truck or a trailer with it, we can group that, so at least we know then that they're actually floating or moving assets, or rolling stock as is what's used more commonly in commodity processing environments, to be able to basically highlight and then reflect that. As I go down a little bit further, one of the aspects I wanted to cover with you today was the fact that our assets, our maintenance assets, can be actually separate than fixed assets, and also from production as well. And the reason for that is pretty simple. There are lots of environments where you have older machines that are no longer considered depreciable. So you don't have a depreciation schedule basically set up for that asset, because it's not considered pretty much a fixed asset that you want to maintain inside of the system. Well, let's say you want to still do maintenance though on that, but that maintenance is going to be an expense basically when you actually post it, and you're not going to depreciate it. Well, in that situation, what you would do is you would set up an asset, but you wouldn't have a fixed asset then related to it. And the same then goes from a resource perspective. Resources inside of Dynamics 365 allow us to basically tie an asset to some production-based capability inside of our environment. We call those resources. So an example of that extruder line 1 would be a resource potentially inside of Dynamics, and we would then bind both the maintenance asset that we're looking at here with that particular resource. Because maybe what we want to do, as you can see up here, is that we want to schedule downtime, so that way when we're running the planning system, it's actually going to block out that particular time period so that we can actually do production processing, or we can't do production processing with a downtime event. So it allows for us then to keep everything all together and glued together to be able to do some of those more extended and advanced concepts that you may want to actually implement inside of your environment. As I go down a little bit further here, this is where we can do a couple of other things as well then with an asset that's really important to kind of note. Number one, we can add attributes then to assets so that if you don't want to do, for example, custom fields, because each asset, for example, a motor may have a current or a voltage designator on it that you want to track inside of here. And maybe those voltages you want to have, for example, if it's going to be 240 or 480, you want to be able to align the right type of resource with it, because maybe you even have even more powerful high induction motors that are above 600 volts that are considered high voltage, right? And you need a different class of employee when a work order is being generated to be able to address that, or just machine training for that example as well. Well, this is where we can then go through and then set up different types of attributes then that are related then to this particular asset, so we can use those for the reporting and processing and future processes inside of our system. We have the ability, for example, to tie what purchase order was this on? What vendor did we buy it from? Do we have any warranty information for it? What's the start and end date of the warranty? We also have the ability, and this is not as common in commodity processors, but if you do have an asset that you actually have on site at a customer, you can actually then reflect that that customer has that particular asset. So we allow for us to basically then drive some of that additional information then from an asset perspective. And then finally, as we look a little bit deeper here, this is where we can then start setting up some of the advanced capabilities for this asset in terms of maintenance plans, in terms of that location's maintenance plans, and then also maintenance rounds. Now, I want to highlight the key differences with this. Maintenance plans are obviously going to be something that generate a work order based upon a particular event that may be occurring. And in our system, we have two different types of events. We have time-based events, so that every 6 months, for example, we're actually going through and replacing a filter is the most common scenario with that, right? But we also then have counter-based events, which allows us basically to be able to capture the number of times a press went through, or the number of bushels that were crushed, for example. And maybe at that point, after a certain volume or metric, or a counter as we call it, has processed through that particular asset, we then want to be able to drive that maintenance event instead of doing it based upon a time period as part of that. A lot of organizations that move to this, so we'll talk a little bit beyond commodity processors, filters, for example, everyone always used to do it every 6 months. But depending upon the flow rate that you had, you're going to obviously consume more of that filtration depending upon whether or not that flow was on or off, right? But if it was off for 2 months of that 6 months, well, you don't, those filters can get expensive. It's an expense, right, that you have to use with it. Well, by using counter-based ones, you're able to basically change it when it actually hits that particular metric that you've designed as part of that. So it allows for a lot of great capabilities with that. Now, the first is that you can actually tie this, for example, to the actual asset itself. So I can actually set up the asset and I can say, here's going to be the maintenance plan towards that particular asset. But what I can also do is I can have maintenance plans that are by where the asset is located inside of the environment. So if I have all my assets grouped outside, for example, and I want to have a maintenance plan that I basically do all of the outside assets, well, I could set up, for example, a functional maintenance plan for that particular outside location that we set up to be able to go through and do that processing. So the cool thing about this, though, is the fact that you can set this up at a couple of other levels too. So I can, based upon, for example, the asset type, and if I click on, for example, that asset type, I can actually go through and then set up different types of maintenance job types that are related to this as well, more at a higher level now, obviously, with these particular assets. So I can actually set up as well groupings that are different than from where the actual asset is located, so that I can actually create maintenance plans, for example, for all crushers, because maybe I've got different crushers in different areas of the actual facility or different buildings, but I want to have a maintenance plan that generates it for all of those types of products or assets as part of that process. So it doesn't have to be at the individual asset. It can be at a higher level with it, and it can also be location specific as well as part of your processing. Maintenance rounds are obviously a little bit different than actual maintenance plans. Rounds are typically something that you do daily, right? So you're basically going through and doing a checklist to ensure that a machine is operational to that standard. And those rounds then, sometimes it's even after each run, for example. Well, you can set up these maintenance rounds then as well to be able to basically generate work orders for you to go through your processing. So a lot of great capabilities when we start talking about the asset in a lot more detail here. Now, one of the other things that I want to highlight just really quickly while we're on this screen is this functional location concept as well. And so as we drill into, for example, a functional location, this is where we can see, for example, all the different assets that have been installed, for example, inside of this particular location. And the functional locations by default in my demo environment, if I right click and just view the details with it, show me, for example, all the different types that are there. And I can create new ones as well. So I can do plants, for example, and I can also do areas inside of this demo environment. But if you want to have a more complex functional location hierarchy, you can define that and then use that inside of your environment to be able to really drive some of those additional processes that you may have inside of your environment. And just to kind of highlight that, when we look at, for example, functional locations, and I click on this, for example, to see all functional locations, we can see here, for example, that we have inside of our plant, we have a plant, and then we have all these different areas, and you can see that depending upon where the area is, it all allows us to really go through and do that indentation inside of here as well. So that way you can really reflect what your plant looks like, so to speak, from a hierarchy perspective, and then be able to interact with it. And there's some really cool views then that we get with that from an asset management perspective. So if I want to look at my asset view, for example, I can see then the location where I have this. I can drill into that location and I can see, for example, the extruder lines that we have. And in our extruder lines, I can see then the assets that are inside of there. And then from that asset, I can see the child assets that are related to it, because these are actually assets that we can repair as part of this major grouping of the asset. So maybe we're depreciating, for example, EX101, but we want to be able to do different types of repairs and service on these individual child assets that are related with this parent. So this is a really cool view just to kind of allow you to navigate quickly to be able to see how many work orders are in this particular asset, how many requests are out there. And you can do it at the higher level too as you go through this to be able to see then all those additional details that we have then inside of Dynamics to drive that.